So hi everybody, my name is Brian Shea. I'm the room host for this session. I'm a principal at a small strategic consulting firm in the DC area called Simon Everett. We work on a range of analytic and strategic planning issues ranging from global security studies to international trade and development to technology futures. But our specific connection to cybersecurity actually runs right through Colorado Springs. For the past few years, we've worked with a diverse range of stakeholders in the Colorado Springs region to take stock of the region's cyber assets, perform a comparative assessment of that local cyber ecosystem to other major cyber hubs across the nation, and develop and implement a strategic plan to help attract more cyber workers, executives, and investors to the region. Through that, I've met many of the folks who are putting on this program today, which brings us to our speaker, Dr. Andrea Little-Limbago. Andrea is a computational social scientist specializing in the intersection of technology, national security, and information security. As the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Interos, Andrea leads the company's research and analytic work applying computational methodologies to global supply chain risk with a focus on globalization, cybersecurity, and geopolitics. She's a co-program director for the Emerging Tech and Cybersecurity Program at the National Security Institute at George Mason, where she publishes on digital authoritarianism, data protection, and the impact of emerging technospheres of influence. Andrea is also an industry advisory board member for the data science program at George Washington University, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center, and a board member for the Washington, D.C. chapter of Women in Security and Privacy. She previously taught in academia, was a technical lead at the Department of Defense, and was chief social scientist at Endgame and Virtru, where she remains an advisor focusing on privacy policy and data protection across the globe. And finally, she earned her PhD in political science from the University of Colorado at Boulder and a bachelor's from Bowdoin College. That's a very long-winded way of saying that you will be hard-pressed to find someone who can give us more insights about the topic we're here to talk about today, which is rethinking cyber risk in a reglobalized world. So with that, Dr. Limbago, thank you for being here today to share your insights and for helping us consider this very complex topic.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here. And again, as mentioned, I went to grad school in Colorado, so a very big fan of the whole region. I'm very excited to see interest in this topic. I think it is one of the more important topics I'll be redefining a lot of our future going forward. So please feel free to ask questions. Definitely happy to engage in a dialogue along any of this. And then if you have questions afterwards as well, please feel free to reach out to me. And so even in the title, what does that even mean? And so, we're undergoing a major transformation right now in the way that the world system is organized, and a lot of it directly impacts the way we think about cybersecurity and cyber risk. And so I'll sort of walk you through some of these changes and key trends to keep an eye on and how they'll be impacting all of our lives going forward. And so what I want to start with is the pandemic and how so many of the trends I'll be talking about were really already there under the surface, but it really has accelerated them in a significant way. And the reason for it is because it's been a huge exogenous shock. And so whenever there's a big shock to the system, a major disruption, it can have a big disruption both in the areas of global health and social systems, but also really permeates through other areas of our lives. And the why this is so unprecedented, well beyond the horrific human toll, looking at the economic activity that's happened across the globe, everything from a third of the global economy grinding to a halt in a couple of weeks. The scale and scope of that just is unprecedented in modern times. In the US, unemployment jump was extremely significant. GDP loss, from a third to 40% during a very short period of time. And just this estimate for the cost of it, and just the numbers that we keep seeing, continuing to go up across the globe, really is significant. If you look at how it's impacted trade, you can see that the big dearth in the drop off right at 2020, and we'll see how it does rebound. But again, it's important to understand just how much of a shock to the system and unprecedented nature of it. And I do feel we say unprecedented a lot. Unfortunately, that really is the term to describe what's going on right now, and it's why so many playbooks that companies and universities and that global scholars thought about are being rewritten right now. And what it's doing with such an enormous shock is that all these forces and trends that were sort of just under the surface prior to the pandemic are really accelerated now. And so first one being the reemergence of economic nationalism. And so if you think about globalization, and we've had a few decades of globalization with the a push towards ever increasing free flow of goods and services across borders, that did start to actually, the pace of it started to decline a little bit over the last few years. But with, as those charts just showed you, it's really just hit a wall with the pandemic and really enormous shock to the global trading system. And so while there was a shortage of that, or decline a bit as far as the pace of the expansion, it really has been shocked quite a bit, with countries looking more so inward versus outward, and seeing the rise of tariffs and barriers and trade wars in the current era. We're also seeing the fracturing of the internet. So if you've heard about the splinternet or the balkanization of the internet, this is what we're talking about. And so what that means is that, similar to how globalization had the, imagined a global spread of goods and services across borders, similar for the internet as far as the free flow of information across a world wide web. And while those aspirations were there in the beginning, and still are there for many people who want to see free flow of information and all the benefits that can give you, what we're seeing instead is really the borders and the walls are starting to pop up around nation states. And so instead of having clicking on a website and looking the same in one place as in another place, as was imagined, they look very different now based on a whole variety of censorship and data access. And then we're seeing rising geopolitical tensions. And so that's the trade war that I mentioned, but we're also seeing territorial conflicts. And most recently we're seeing with Armenia and Azerbaijan, their recent ceasefire. We're also seeing Ethiopian conflict over various areas of land on top of major power competitions. We're seeing a rise in various kinds of conflicts as well as major power competition, and all of this is reshaping international relations. And these forces, they all were there prior to the pandemic, but they're all accelerated at a significant pace. And what we're seeing emerge instead are these technospheres. And so this is a term that the economists used, and I like it quite a bit. So instead of thinking about just various kinds of ideological spheres, which it is partly, what we're seeing actually is this, the broader spheres of influence that are driven by different kinds of technologies as well as the ideologies. They reflect the ideologies of the various states. And so it is something that's accelerating. And I'll talk about the two different spheres that we're seeing and go into a little bit of detail on them. The first I want to talk about is digital authoritarianism. And so when we think about that, think about these technospheres falling along a spectrum where you have authoritarians on one side and democracies on the other. It's a spectrum though. Excuse me. And there is no ideal model for each end, but there are bits and pieces and tactics and procedures and laws and governance factors that are indicative of each of the extreme. And so sort of the digital authoritarianism, if you think about it, is this use by largely authoritarian regimes to control information within their borders, and not just within their borders, but really across the globe as well, depending on what their objectives are. And so, if you think about international relations, one of the key rules of thumb for leaders is to stay in power. And for authoritarian leaders, one way to stay in power is for complete information control, and that's through a wide variety of tactics. For the last few decades, we saw that with cyber attacks and stealing data, exfiltration of data. We're also seeing manipulation of data, disinformation, censorship going on, astroturfing, which is basically throwing out a lot of information into social media platforms so that real information can't surface to the top. That's another form of censorship. And so there are all these different tools that are being used, and it's not just, China and Russia, I think, are the ones that come to mind the most. It's not just those countries. It's being adopted by many more, and this playbook is starting to expand. And we're seeing countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Venezuela, and then even, obviously we're seeing quite a bit of disinformation in the United States. So it spreads, these tactics spread, and that's why what happens in these tactics that occur in these countries don't just stay in those countries. They do spread and impact people across the globe. And for the digital authoritarianism model, this control of information is really key to political survival. And that's where that aspect comes in. So conversely, sort of on this other end of the spectrum, we hear about digital democracies. And this still is very aspirational. I would argue that digital authoritarianism is much more well established. That playbook is fairly well known. It continues to evolve, but it's much more mature. Democracies have been very late to the game in many ways in trying to be a counterweight to this digital authoritarianism. And so what we're seeing now is just really the emergence of democracies starting to pick up and try and provide a counterweight to the digital authoritarianism that we've seen. And so you think about the aspirational visions of a free, open, secure internet, that still is there. And I think aspirational is key, but if we don't aspire to something really strong and lofty, then we're not going to even get, move in the right direction. So it's really imperative to think about what the ideal playbook may look like. It's also a multi-stakeholder model. And so where digital authoritarianism really is focused on, controlling, the cyber sovereignty and the notion of controlling information within the state, digital democracies do tend to look more for the various kinds of alliances and creating a shared vision amongst democracies and civil liberties and human rights and digital rights across the globe. And pursuing that through both the technological lens of creating secure technologies and secure ways to protect your data and transfer data, but also through the policies, laws, and norms as well. And for digital democracies, it's freedom of information as a universal right. And this is something that we're seeing more and more as a discussion on digital rights as human rights. And a lot of it is in response to the suppression of individual freedoms through digital authoritarianism. It's also through the growing acknowledgement of just the essential role that digital rights are playing and will continue to play in all of our lives going forward. And importantly, when I've discussed some of these trends over the last few years, from either technologists, policymakers, those in government, we really saw this as something that was, these divisions starting to emerge, but really, a few years out, it's here now. And that's, again, with the pandemic, it's really hard to understate how fast some of these changes have come because of that great impact, but then also all these other sort of under the surface tensions were there and have started to surface. And we're in a world now where we are seeing these technospheres, these tectonic shifts are underway, where we're having different ideological visions and technologies across the globe. And just if you don't believe me, just believe the headlines if you want. These are just a couple of them. On the one hand, you've got examples of India banning over 100 Chinese apps, Australia banning Huawei and 5G network, many other countries banning Huawei. Japan helping, incentivizing some of their companies to reshore from China. And then on the other end, we're seeing greater technological ties and cooperation among China, Russia, we're seeing Iran, Pakistan, from many of the authoritarianism and seeing that model and that playbook start to spread on that side as well. I think, perhaps for many who are big TikTok users, this past few days has been a big day in that sort of the ban came and went, and we're not really sure what's going to happen with that. We will see, but that was that just shows you how much of the social media gets caught up in all of this and impacted by it. So when we talk about all this, what does all this reglobalization restructuring really have to do with cybersecurity? And at the end of the day, a lot of this restructuring is driven by the various kinds of new cyber risks that are out there and that are emerging due to this. And so on the one hand, many companies and perhaps your universities still focus on the 3 lines of defense. And that's what a recent Gartner poll basically found, that most companies are focusing on the various kinds of security controls, what the legal requirements are, and what legal and compliance requirements and the internal audits. And those are really important. And as I go beyond and talk about these other issues going forward, I think it's really important to note that those are still really important. It's just that they're not sufficient. If you think about necessary and sufficient conditions, they are necessary but not sufficient for the world that is already here. And a large part of that is because they can't deal with the fast pace of the changing world environment, the fast pace of the risk, and then also the interconnectivity. And that, again, this is a notion that comes up again and again, as well as far as has the pandemic killed globalization? And I'd argue it absolutely has not. It's restructuring it for sure. These interconnected risks are still going to be there. And so how can we think about adapting cyber risk to a reglobalized world? Definitely need something that's more dynamic, a multi-factor approach to it that integrates these range of disruptions and vulnerabilities. And I'll talk about the some 4 different areas in just a minute. Many organizations still focus on reasonable, appropriate data measures and data security measures. Again, those are important. They're good for showing compliance, but they're simply not enough. There's a whole range of concerns and risk factors across tech stacks, and really seeing the convergence of these physical and digital supply chains is something that, again, it's something that's not quite, it's been on the radar, but really, I don't think has been ingrained just how complex and insecure some of these different connectivities have become. And so what I'd like to do is walk briefly through 4 different areas of how cyber risk and some of these new reglobalization trends are impacting cyber risk. And so we'll talk about blackouts, government mandated data access. We'll focus on the digital supply chain and what that is and why that matters. And then talk about these growing number of restrictions that are popping up. So those prohibitions that I was talking about as far as limiting 5G from your network to not allowing investment in certain companies. And that's what actually just happened overnight or late yesterday evening. 31 more the US banned 31 more companies, Chinese-based companies from US investors. And that's just part of this broader trend that we're starting to see. In the area of internet blackouts, this is one of those that I do feel has a lot of potential for extra scholarship and work. So for those of you working in and looking for a new, either a dissertation or a new thesis report, I think internet blackouts is a area that needs a lot more eyes on it. Internet blackouts these are, to be clear, these are internet blackouts that are intentional by the government. They are not the blackouts that pertain to internet disruption due to a tsunami or a hurricane. Those are very important and they matter a lot, as does lack of access in rural areas of countries. What I'm really focusing on here though is intentional government blackouts. And it largely happens during protests and elections and other kinds of conflicts. It is for suppression of information and limiting communication during those times is how governments are using them largely in authoritarian regimes. And they've increased 6,000% from 2011 to 2018, costing about $8 billion in 2019. So they are very expensive. And it's not just something that's a geopolitical concern for organizations that are working in those areas or have partners in those areas. It can completely disrupt supply chains if you have partnerships in those areas. Especially if we think about last year alone, they impacted 33 different countries, and they still continue to be on the rise. And they are, they are much more prevalent in authoritarian regimes. But the first example up there, India, had an internet blackout for 100 days in Kashmir. And so even there still are some limitations there. But the full blackout was, surpassed 100 days, which is, it's amazing. They broke the record for democracies. Myanmar has the record for authoritarian regimes. More recently, even though that was just a little while ago, we saw them during the Belarus protest to the election in August. And right now we're seeing internet blackouts and shutdowns as the Ethiopian conflict escalates. So that's something to keep an eye on. Absolutely important to follow what the military conflict is, but looking at how the internet shutdown is a tool used by the government as well during this time, I think is something that we'll see more and more. We're also seeing government mandated data access. And so while this matters importantly because we think a lot about, there's data exfiltration, data access that happens through breaches and through hacks, and it does. And that's, again, those risks that were there before, as far as cyber attacks, absolutely still there, and they're still on the rise. But now governments are also finding ways to access data through mandating legislation that requires access if a company is within their borders. And this can happen through data localization, through data storage requirements that requires companies to store all their data or their citizens' data within sovereign boundaries. Many of those data localization laws also have data seizure components to it where if the government wants access to the data, you're required to turn it over. There also are anti-encryption policies. And these are policies that require weakened encryption for the government to be able to access. And so you think with, encryption is something almost every, it's one of those things that's it's virtually anonymous that security scholars believe that encryption is one of the best ways to protect data. And yet there's more and more policies popping up that require a backdoor weakening that weakening that encryption security. And it is one of those ways that it'll overall weaken security for legitimate companies and legitimate actors while enabling malicious actors to still have access to that kind of capability. And this is a great example of, we're not seeing this just in authoritarian regimes. We're seeing it in Australia, passed a law about almost on 2 years ago, I think, for requiring backdoor access by the government. The Five Eyes countries recently put out a joint statement requesting lawful access to data through weakened encryption, and that covers the US, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, and Canada. Some of the core democracies still pushing forth this area, and their arguments are for access to data and for national security reasons. At the same time, it's not going to prevent malicious actors from securing their data, regardless. And it's one of those things that's, these crypto wars have been going on for a couple of decades. We'll see what happens this time around, but it's something that could absolutely weaken security for the good guys. And the recent example of how these different laws come together, look at Hong Kong's national security law, where law enforcement agencies are able to now compel websites to hand over data, block data, restrict user access, all sorts of these components of information control that I've been talking about. And I think this is a really good infographic. It's from Freedom House, covering some of the recent work on this rise of data sovereignty and governments really building up these walls, both limiting what information comes in, but also then having control of that data through these various kinds of legislation within their borders. And the other aspect to note on this is just knowing that it is a spectrum, from more open to more closed, more focus on freedoms, less focus on, or more focus on government access. So it is absolutely a spectrum when you think about it. See, the next area is digital supply chain risks. Digital supply chain risks, if you think about think about supply chains, we largely think about a company headquartered in one country, and then you think about all the different areas of where all their suppliers are across the globe. And that absolutely still is a major area of concern, and where we've seen enormous supply chain disruptions. But it's not just physical supply chains that are being disrupted, so are digital supply chains. And what often happens with these is when malicious hardware or software provides backdoor access into a system, and it very often happens through the use of legitimate software. And that's what makes it so hard, is that it's this legitimate software becomes corrupted, and you think that you're updating a certain product, and it turns out that there is malicious software embedded within those legitimate updates. The CCleaner attack is a really good example of this, where CCleaner, it's legitimate software that's used. They were doing an update, and what the attackers did was they were able to embed malicious software within that update. And when people around the globe ended up updating it, it led to 2.27 million downloads of that malware. So that, again, across the globe, basically from that 2.27, 1.65 million of those computers phoned back to the attacker. And the attackers then went through and became a very targeted attack, and they implemented it as second stage attack, implementing ShadowPad, installing ShadowPad, which is basically a malware suite almost, where there's key logging and other kinds of capabilities within there, onto 11 companies and based in 40 different installations. And it was, it's one of those examples of where it's a widespread attack, but really with a targeted nature, and it was a 2 steps. And all of it goes back to a legitimate software update. It's very, very hard to prevent those kind of what seems to be legitimate. You've got users thinking they're following good cyber hygiene, and it turns out that's how the attack happens. Dragonfly 2.0 is a similar. It was targeted at the energy sector, and it was another way that supply chain attacks leveraged or installed through trusted software, and then providing access throughout systems. And again, just 2 good examples. There are many, many more. Like I said, there's almost an 80% increase last year in these kind of attacks. And it can happen also actually through some unintentional hardware and software vulnerabilities as well. So these are on the rise. They're very hard to protect against. But one point to really keep in mind is that part of this is that you need to look at the entire ecosystem when thinking about cyber risks. So it's both all your partners and your entire partner ecosystem. It's also all the software that you're using and all the software that your partners are using as well. All of that provides additional means for vulnerabilities. And if you're interested in these kind of things, the Wall Street Journal had a really good op-ed back in July, highlighting that even if you have built the best, most secure barriers around your enterprise, at the end of the day, if you've got a supplier or partner within your ecosystem who's not doing the same kind of safeguards, that can provide a means into your network. And if blackouts and government mandated access and digital supply chain access wasn't enough, on top of all this, organizations are dealing with a really, really dynamic compliance landscape. And all this matters, and you can see this compliance landscape really syncs and mirrors the geopolitical landscape, which is why also how this matters so much as far as the restructuring of globalization. It's mirrored so much in compliance landscape right now. One example is Section 889 of the National Defense Authorization Act. And there's a lot, that's sort of a lot of acronyms and sort of wonky policy components hidden within there. Basically what it says is the federal government cannot partner with and contract with organizations that have basically 5 core Chinese-based companies or their affiliates within their system. And so it's Huawei, ZTE, Dahua, Hytera, and Hikvision, and all their affiliates and subsidiaries. So the government cannot, if you have any of those within your system, you can no longer work with the government. And so it becomes something very, very expensive, millions, if not billions of dollars for companies to basically tear and rip out and replace if they turn out they have those companies within their ecosystem. The converse angle is a CMMC, which is a cybersecurity maturity certification, which is, I guess, good seal of approval. And when you're thinking about all of your partners and your ecosystem, the CMMC could be a good way to figure out who does have those higher security standards than others, if you're thinking if all else being equal. And then finally, we've got the OFAC sanctions. Those are Treasury sanctions that since 2015 have been used against cyber attacks. So that was a new addition to how sanctions and a whole of government approach can be used to deal with the cyber, this dynamic cyber landscape. And importantly, it's not just the US, right? It's a global trend. You've got India, Australia, EU, UK, all of them pursuing various means to restrict or prohibit various kinds of untrusted software and hardware from within their systems. And if you look at the way it's all divided, when we talked about digital authoritarianism and digital democracies, these kind of compliance restrictions very much fall along that division. And something conversely that we're seeing is that democracies are starting to try and pursue various kinds of cooperative agreements amongst themselves. The UK, in the middle of the summer, proposed a 10-country pact of democracies for 5G collaboration. And so we'll see what happens. There's a discussion along the lines that, whereas we had military alliances and trade agreements for the last century, it may become tech alliances, maybe the defining feature of, of the new globalization for this century. And all that, matters across the entire tech stack. So the entire restriction and prohibitions not just impact, the app stores or cloud-based services, it's the carriers, it's the apps, app stores. And then an area that's just starting to gain some traction and discussion is concern over undersea cables and the whole range of information that flows under those, and they all have different owners. And that ownership is going to matter. And I imagine that we'll see quite a bit more emphasis on ensuring the trusted undersea cables as well for information flows. And so that's a lot, and just give a couple minutes to make some sense of it all, and then leave some time for questions. But one area I really want to stress is while we're seeing these new trends, and again, some of them they were there before, but are really accelerated. These prior risk factors, such as cyber attacks and the disinformation, and ensuring that you've got the proper security controls and access controls, all those risk factors still apply. And that's what makes it so much more complicated now, is that we need to focus both on those threats that we've had for quite some time, and these new risks to our data access, information control, data integrity, and so forth. And for the first rule of thumb in international relations, a good long time saying of where you stand depends on where you sit. Now think about it, where you stand depends on where your data sits. And this is a map from NetBlocks on internet blackouts in Venezuela. And they're a good, if you're on Twitter, they do a good job updating the latest internet blackouts if you're interested in that kind of thing. I think it's pretty interesting to see where they do arise. But it can be a significant point of data disruption and concern in that area. Also matters because of the data access. And for each of these cases, again, national borders do exist on the internet. We are seeing those walls start to emerge higher and higher, basically leading to more of that splinter net or that balkanization of the internet, more so than we've seen in the past. And if you're familiar with the notion of the weaponization of cyber, this is something that's been debated, on and off about whether there is, whether it's been going on. I think for the most part, we've seen the weaponization of data in areas within cyber quite a bit. What we're seeing more and more, though, and we'll probably see more and more into the next decade, is this weaponization of trade. Industrial policy is making a comeback, and we're seeing that with these prohibitions and restrictions, and with the rise of various kinds of trade laws and practices that are being, that basically weaponize trade against other countries in new forms of economic warfare. And where it overlaps with cyber is through this notion of untrusted hardware and software. And those are this whole rise of these prohibition and restrictions. What I didn't get into is that even in the U.S., the Department of Commerce has added, in 2019, added over 100 Chinese companies to their restrictions list, added another 100 plus so far this year. And all those are focused on these various kinds of, concerns over trusted hardware and software, use of surveillance technology. Some of those companies are using surveillance technology for human rights violations. Some were for building the South China Sea islands. And it's really, that's where you see so much of the geopolitics coming into play in the various forms of cyber and trade policies that are coming and starting to emerge. And the big focus underlying it all with the cyber risk is, are you putting software or hardware within your system that is untrusted and could lead to significant access concerns? And while you're worrying about your own organization, think about all your partners. In universities, even if one university has a great security system, most researchers do partner with other universities. That automatically leads to various kinds of partnerships and various ways to access a network. And that's something that's increasingly challenging. It matters for global supply chains. The average global brand has, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of suppliers. It becomes very complex to track them all and to track their data. So looking ahead, a couple of rules of thumb as well for what, this new world order that we're entering, what it is and what it is not. Importantly, it's not a new Cold War. Some people say it is, and so again, everyone can take it with a grain of salt. My opinion is it's absolutely not, and I think it's way too narrow of a mindset when you think about the way we're entering. And in large part, there's a lot that we can learn from previous eras, and we need to make sure that we learn from them. But if we were to cut and paste all the policies from the Cold War into now, they aren't sufficient. It's way more complex. Technology has changed, the world has changed, and we need to acknowledge that. And that's why it's great having students become interested in these kind of topics. There's so much room for new and creative thinking in this area that I'm excited to see what this next generation of scholars will bring for us. The same is true with death of globalization. Just because, we saw, epic shocks to the trade system happen this year, we have seen some rebounding, and what we're going to see, I don't believe, is globalization will not be dead. It'll be restructured, and it very well could be restructured along these technospheres that I've talked about, with more of the trade and technology ties going amongst democracies and those allies on one group, and then authoritarian regimes on the other. But again, it's a spectrum, and there will be some, there'll be most countries falling somewhere in the middle. So it is not the death of globalization either. Really, the way I like to think about it, and I'd encourage you to think about it, is that it's globalization transformed. We're seeing new governance and rules popping up, very new power structures emerging. Trade flows will be restructured. New technologies continue to evolve. And it's increasing new partnerships and also new risks at the end of the day. And so while we're thinking about it, Tom Friedman, who's written numerous books on basically on every aspect of globalization, does believe it's inevitable, and I do as well. Think we'll continue to see growing interconnectivities. But the difference is, how are we going to shape it? Are we going to allow, sit back and allow more of this digital authoritarian version to take shape, or can we really innovate and be creative and leverage these technologies for improving and enhancing democracy across the globe? And so that's something that we all should be thinking about. Very interesting areas to study, but how can we leverage these technologies also to deepen democracy? Because there is a big debate growing as far as whether democracies are basically up to the task in this new era. So I'll leave you with that. It's a link to a paper that I wrote along these lines that covers some of this. Happy to share any information or take questions now in our remaining time.
Great, thank you for that. I will say for everyone else in the room, if you do have questions, please go ahead and post those in the chat. In the meantime, I have a couple that I'll pose here. One is on the compliance and supply chain aspect that you covered towards the end. Being a government contractor, I'm seeing how that works on the federal side, where the NIST requirements flow down through the large integrators, and if I want to partner, I have to sign up for those requirements. In other industries where the federal government isn't at the top of the supply chain, whether it's automotive or energy or retail, relatively speaking, are those working the same way, or is it hit and miss across industries or across major companies, whether or not they try to enforce their own requirements down through the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So it varies, as you can probably imagine, but it by no means is limited to just the federal ecosystem. Financial systems are very, very concerned about this. We're seeing, I'd say that's the financial system and the aerospace and defense, obviously, are two of the big industries that are seeing a lot of change from this. But I think other industries are very much impacted by it as well. And I think that's why we're seeing both, changes in sort of on the digital supply chain, but it's also why we're seeing companies moving away from China. China has become the global hub, but it did before a reason, as far as the pricing and the labor, the skill set. They basically have created a really great environment for basically becoming the supplier to the world. But when you put all your eggs in one basket, regardless of who it is, it introduces vulnerabilities, and that's why we're seeing, both through when China shut down early on, and there were so many shocks to the supply chains, we saw companies start to really rethink those supply chain aspects of it. And then when you pile on some of the additional risks, I think that we're starting to see more and more companies start to realize that the degree of concentration risk by having all of your eggs in one basket is perhaps not the best way to go. And that's where, we were doing a whole supply chain talk, and there's something called just-in-time production, where companies emerged out of Japan in the 80s for doing really quick, really efficient production, really hyper specialization. And what it led to, though, was this lack of additional buffers for that when there are these shocks, companies aren't able to respond as much. And so it's a combination of all those aspects of it, leading to rethinking how they're going to be dealing with everything that's in their system and then who they're partnering with. And that's why I think it's not just the federal government. I think it's really across industries are realizing, whether it's for national security reasons or just for greater resilience and agility, that they're really rethinking having such reliance on a single company, a single vendor, or a single country.
Great, thank you. And then I want to repeat a question that someone posed in the previous session. I thought it was a really good one, which was in terms of the social impact of blackouts and other issues that you touched upon. Are traditional human rights organizations picking up the cyber component and adding it to their portfolio, so to speak, or are cyber-specific human rights organizations evolving and taking up that mantle?
Yeah, I thought it's a great question. I think it's a really important one, because cybersecurity as an industry has tended to be dominated by folks in computer science and engineering, and we absolutely need that aspect of it. And that's foundational to it. What we haven't seen as much is, are the social and behavioral sciences starting to explore the impact of these technologies and the social element of it all. But that's changing, and that's really, it's actually significantly changing even in the last 5 years. I used to get asked all the time 5 years ago, what's a social scientist doing in cybersecurity? And I never get asked that anymore. And I think I think that reflects just the broader change, where we're seeing, groups that have been around for a while, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, as a great cyber-based or cyber-focused group focusing on digital rights. And they do a lot of really interesting research. But other groups that focus on more human rights broadly are also starting to, to adopt that mantle as well, with the notion that digital rights are increasingly human rights. And I think it's great to see other human rights and nonprofit groups starting to look at what these societal impacts are, because they do impact all of our lives. And other ones that I'd recommend, Access Now is one that does a lot of work on the blackouts angle. and they do some really interesting work, and that's a great one, to follow. For other blackout data, Casper, I think the Australian-based company, has some interesting data, as does the net blocks that I showed. And what's lacking still, though, we still need more. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for students and academics to contribute to this. And they are. I mean, I think we need more. Given the widespread impact and disruptions going on, we really need just so many different angles. And internet blackouts is for sure one that I think deserves additional attention because of just the impact of what's having, that people just aren't discussing quite as much yet.
Okay. Great, thank you. We do have time for one more question. If anybody wants to unmute yourself and lob one final question, we have a few minutes for that.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Hi, my name's Alex. I'm Associate Dean of Letters, Arts, and Sciences here at UCCS. And one of the things that we're really trying to figure out is how to prepare our students for this field. We're not IT, we're not engineering, and trying to wrap our heads around how to speak to this. And so the social scientist stuff is really exciting. We have an interdisciplinary degree where we can kind of start creating more specified focus on this. But I asked this in a previous presentation, what are the kind of go-to skills if, say, history majors or philosophy majors or our sociology majors or our women's and ethnic study majors want to go into this? I mean, you mentioned human rights and all of that. How do we focus them towards this? What are some entry jobs?
And you have 1 minute to answer, unfortunately.
Oh,
sorry. And I can follow up later too.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me. So there are a lot depending on which industry. So initial thought is, threat intelligence is a great one for people with political science or sociology, or even history backgrounds or language backgrounds. Like linguistics, for sure, there's a need in threat intelligence. I'm sure you can imagine what some of the major languages would be that there's interest in. I think that's a huge way, because threat intelligence, at the end of the day, really focus on a lot of the human aspects of it and discerning patterns. And so the underlying the skill sets, I'd argue, critical thinking, teamwork, communication, the ability to write and present and communicate to different groups. I mean, that's where social and behavioral sciences excel. And that honestly is not a very common trait in a lot of our community. Those alone, that's a great place to start.